The purpose of these translation of an analytic task videos is to demonstrate that there is no one way to use the software, or in other words, more than one software tactic is available to fulfill any analytic strategy, and the choice depends not on the most efficient way to use the software, but on the context of the analytic task, which includes what you plan to do next. I'll demonstrate how an analytic task from Chapter 9 would have been done using an analytic planning worksheet, which makes the translation process explicit and conscious. The first part of the video demonstrates how Trina actually did accomplish the task, and then the second half demonstrates an alternative way, and I discuss the pros and cons of each way. In this video, I'll demonstrate Analytic Task 12b on page 177. I'm assuming you've read Chapter 9 and seen Trina's demonstration videos of her case, but as a very quick refresher, Trina and Mary Alice are studying newcomers to an online grief forum, and they analyzed the newcomers' initial posts and the replies to those posts using discourse analysis to identify patterns of discursive features, which is a way of understanding how the concept of grief is constructed on the online forum. A discursive feature is language that serves a particular purpose, or more accurately, enacts a particular function, like telling a story to display empathy. Patterns of discursive features are characteristic sequences or combinations of discursive features that they are seeking to identify. In Analytic Task 12b, they're ready to prioritize the most significant discursive features that they've found so far and identify patterns in those features. Let's start by replaying just a minute and a half from Trina's demonstration video in which she describes how they accomplished this analytic task. Then I will describe how this would be thought through and documented using an analytic planning worksheet, which is simply a way of spelling out or unpacking the unconscious process of how to harness the software. And then I'll demonstrate an alternative way in which this analytic task could have been accomplished.
Phase 12b, prioritize the discursive features evident in the patterns. So now we were curious to see of all the codes, which ones were occurring more frequently. So we sorted codes by groundedness. And actually, I'm going to filter to look just at the reply codes. And I can do that by clicking on the code group here. And extend sympathy was used most frequently, followed by encouraging people to come back. We saw that a lot, where people would say, I'm so sorry for your loss, by extending sympathy, and then say, please come back again. And down here in the comment, you can see that there was some merging of comments from the different codes we had used originally and then combined them because maybe we had used different codes that meant the same thing and we needed to merge those later. We noticed that people often told second stories. Oh, my grief and my experience of loss is quite similar to your experience of loss. So we captured that. So we would go through the data and just double check and read through those by double clicking and clicking through the data. And then we would condense those 11 discursive features into a 3-part pattern of the posts to report in the finding. And that is really in the findings of the paper, and that is really something that's done outside of ATLAS.ti. That's more of a holistic way of looking deeply at a few examples of quotations and really writing that up, the interpretation, outside of the software, although you could also do it in a memo.
Here's an analytic planning worksheet that unpacks Trina's thinking in deciding how to harness the software for Analytic Task 12b. And this is the way we teach new users of the software to accomplish their first analytic tasks. I'll just call these worksheets APWs from here on. You can also print this one out from the website for later reference. I'm assuming you've read Chapter 6, which describes the 5 steps of translation in great detail and how to enter them to an APW. But one important point is that there is no one correct way to use the APW. It depends on how much experience one has with research and also with using ATLAS.ti. In the translation videos for the more straightforward Chapter 8 project, the APWs were also straightforward, and so it seemed like there was just one correct way to use them. You may want to pause the video for a moment and review page 101 and the mindsets diagram at the bottom of the page. Using the APW is in the middle area of this diagram that is governed by a heuristic mindset. So the illustrations of using APWs in this video, and also in the later harnessing component videos, are heuristic. They are examples for guidance, not hard and fast rules. I'll point out some of the places in this analytic planning worksheet where different people might use the worksheet differently. An APW covers one phase of a project, and this is phase 12. The objectives and methodology are there to remind us, while thinking things out, what we are moving towards, as it's very easy to get lost in the details and forget the real purpose of a project. Some people will like a brief summary, as here. Others will value listing out all the specific research questions, if they know they tend to get lost in the details of the analysis easily and lose track of the questions they're trying to answer. Having a summary of the overall plan at level 2 provides the framing for the current tasks. And again, it's very helpful to refer to this framing as we're thinking things out. The Conceptual Framework reminds us of the main concepts we're dealing with in this phase and how they're related. Some people may prefer to just list the main concepts. Others value a graphical representation, as here, especially for a complicated phase of the analysis. And this section lists the activities we have done so far and what we plan to do next. The guts of the APW is the individual analytic tasks. There would be a whole series of tasks for this phase, 12A, 12B, 12C, and so on, but here we're just listing one. Step 1 of translation is to identify the units of the task. Clearly, discursive features is one, and patterns would be another. Here's the first place where things could have been thought out differently. This could easily have been two separate analytic tasks, one to prioritize the discursive features, and a second one to identify the patterns in them. I won't assume what Trina was thinking when she wrote her analytic tasks for Chapter 9, but we can guess and say that having done many discourse analysis projects, she knew that the activity of prioritizing the features overlapped with thinking about possible emerging patterns in them, and it was easier to combine these as a slightly larger single task. The general idea is that when starting out with this process, analytic tasks are limited in scope and best limited to a single unit. But with growing experience, analytic tasks become larger in scope, as this one is here. Step 2 of translation is thinking out and writing the purpose, which then makes it very clear how to proceed. The purpose, like everything else, is informed by the methodology, which in this case interprets a valid pattern of discursive features as being based on the prevalent discursive features in the data. So we must first identify the most prevalent features before we can identify any patterns. In step 3, we think through each component of the software to see which ones could represent each unit, initially using the list of components and the actions that can be taken on each one. But very soon, our growing experience will make it obvious which components are possible candidates. This is not a pedantic exercise, even for experienced researchers. Identifying the possible components often triggers a different or not obvious way that something can be done in the software. For example, because patterns are worked on by writing, a memo could be used. That triggers Trina to weigh up the advantages and disadvantages of using ATLAS.ti memos in contrast to her usual way of switching to Word when writing was involved. Her comment right at the end of the last clip implied that for this task, she didn't see any advantages in doing this writing in an ATLAS.ti memo. Realizing that patterns are relations among discursive feature codes also reminds us that networks are a potential component that could be used to represent patterns of these codes. Step 4 is the critical step of deciding which of the candidates to pick, based on the context of the analytic task and particularly what we plan to do next, which in this case is to print out coded quotations for further work in Word, because Trina has decided to do it that way and not to represent the patterns of discursive features in ATLAS.ti at all. And the explanation documents her thinking. Finally, the tool is documented that we're going to use. In other words, the activities that involve a component and an action. Here we list what Trina demonstrated in her video. This is a constructed tool, combining several different selected tools, because Trina had identified a larger analytic task than a beginning ATLAS.ti user or beginning researcher might choose to identify when starting out with 5-level QDA. Reflections spur thinking about how we plan to proceed based on what has been accomplished, which in this case is identifying 3 patterns of discursive features. Now, as we know, these patterns have not been translated to components, and so they're not represented in ATLAS.ti. But looking at Trina's journal article that resulted from this project, we can see that the 3 patterns were to extend sympathy, encourage newcomers to come back, and to provide second stories. We'll use those products of this analytic task in the next APW, in which I propose a different way to fulfill the task by representing these emergent patterns in components of the software.